Hi, my name is Claire. I want to start with a question that I thought would be far more left field until Dan brought up Max Headroom, but the question is, what is science fiction? Many people in response to this question throw together a collection of tropes. Science fiction is outer space. Science fiction is rockets and lasers and men traveling to the corners of the universe. But that's only the simplest way of defining what's actually a fairly complex literary and cultural form. In fact, there's something of a cottage industry with academics of defining new and more comprehensive definitions of what science fiction is, which is a genre that changes as frequently as our relationship to the future itself. And because it means a lot of different things for a lot of different people, a singular definition of it is difficult to grasp. Because the boundaries are really squiggly, and the more granular you get with a question, the more difficult the answer becomes. Like, for example, does science fiction necessarily have to take place in the future? Well, no, because all fiction has some kind of temporal relationship to the time in which it was written, and even sort of canonical science fiction texts, like Star Wars, take place a long, long time ago. Does science fiction have to be rigorous in its science or technological approach? Yes, there is a culture of science fiction, hard SF, in which that is an important quality, but many of our most important science fiction writers flub the science or considered it secondary to the central problems of their work. William Gibson, for example, wrote Neuromancer on a typewriter with very little to no knowledge of the internet as it was being formed, and Ray Bradbury very famously put air on Mars in the Martian Chronicles. So if we try to define science fiction by first determining what it isn't, we enter into an equally thorny area. Why is Slaughterhouse-Five shelved under literature in bookstores when its protagonist is abducted by aliens from the planet Trafalmador, but equally literary books by people like Joanna Russ or Ursula Le Guin or James Tiptree Jr. are relegated to the mothballed corner of science fiction / fantasy? And if we try to define where that slash falls between science fiction and fantasy, it's even more hairy, because if aliens and robots and far future scenarios are permitted, then why aren't dragons and elves, etc.? The truth is, a lot of different kinds of texts qualify as science fictional, right? I mean, books about parallel histories and alternate realities and futures so distant that they may as well be mythic or ancient. Books where there are artificial intelligences on our desktops or extraterrestrial intelligences far off in the cosmos. In my study of this genre, which is informal but lifelong, I have only really found one hard and fast rule about science fiction, which I'm going to try to explain to you now. Okay, so imagine a world. It can be the Earth, if that is easier for you to imagine. In 99% of science fiction, it is the Earth in some veiled capacity. Whatever the world is, you must think of it as a starting point. It can have as tumultuous a history as you like, but for the time being, it is a world that exists in a state of present condition, with set physics and set social dynamics. Okay, now change one thing about that world. What kind of thing? Anything. It can be aesthetic, it can be metaphysical, ecological, political. Usually takes the form of a question. For example, a technological question might be, what would happen if all the computers woke up tomorrow and said hello? Or what would happen if we cracked faster than light speed travel? It can be a deeply human question. You know, what if we cease to be able to breed in the biological manner in which we are accustomed? What if we radically upend social structures? Pose and answer one of these questions, and you immediately create what genre critics call a radical discontinuity, which is a particular form of cognitive dissonance unique to science fiction, in which a world is essentially similar or the same to what you are accustomed to, except for a few singularly changed variables. Radical discontinuities are what makes science fiction, not rockets, not outer space, not far-flung timelines. They're also what makes science fiction a particularly potent tool of first response for artists, because every radical discontinuity is inherently critical. By posing an alternative to the world, either an aspirational alternative or an alternative that serves as a warning, depending on your proclivity for utopia or dystopia. Using discontinuity for critique isn't isolated to critiques of technology or society. It can work for art, I think, or it can, although I don't see it used very much. In a lot of science fiction that deals with art or music, you know, the mark is frequently missed. You look at musical sequences in science fiction films like the Mos Eisley Cantina in Star Wars or the Cave Rave in The Matrix. It doesn't tell you anything about the future. It's usually just like the shorthand of exoticism or something. But I think it can be done in art, and I think it can be used in an interesting way for art criticism. I'm thinking of the work of Mark von Schlegel. Does anybody know his work? Okay, yeah, cool. He's a science fiction writer who comes from art criticism, and he's published a handful of really incredible novels with semiotext, but he's so far outside of the science fiction landscape that he can only really publish in like highfalutin European art magazines and exhibition catalogs, and he makes these incredibly funny and biting critiques of the art world that I think are an indicator of what could be possible if we took that idea seriously. So, for example, in one of his stories, he presents the future of contemporary art as a hybrid of, quote, all the essentially harmless activities of the Western cultural tradition in a new practice called kulturnautics, which is, among other things, a circus of mathematically impossible pavilions that are sprouting up rudely and constantly into the lives of the working poor. This kind of thing is really snarky, of course, but it represents to me, again, what is possible when we begin to think seriously about speculative fiction as a form of art writing or art criticism. No matter what the point of focus is, though, when we practice the mental calisthenics of determining the difference between the real world that we live in and the variable world at hand in a science fiction, when we try to discover where the radical discontinuities have been made and try to determine how we, in our reality, can be led to the juncture at which those discontinuities are formed, we learn a great deal about what is seemingly natural to us in the world, and it makes us reevaluate everything that we take for granted. These strangenesses of science fiction can help clarify the normal, and they can also demonstrate the inherently arbitrary nature or historical nature of many social constructions. Science fiction confronts us in a very specifically cognitive way that is designed to leave us as readers wondering a great many things. It's designed to pose questions. Questions like, where are we headed? Or whether we are complicit with the world, or whether we are really ourselves at all. Radical discontinuities do not require temporal extrapolation. They do not require the future in any capacity, which is another one of those assumed hard tenets of science fiction. Yes, the easiest way to understand the effect of a discontinuity is to play it out over time and see how it modifies and takes root in the world. But something like a parallel history, such as in Philip K. Dick's Man in the High Castle, a novel which takes place in a world where the Allies lost the war, can do the same kind of critical work while taking place in the present. And the kinds of science fictions which emerged from mundane SF, which was a movement in the mid-2000s in science fiction, that was kind of like a Dogma 95 for science fiction. It called for stories that took place in the near future with very little technology, with very little theatrics. It argued that, as in the manifesto, it said, our most likely future is one in which we only have ourselves and this planet. And it called for fiction which spoke to those realities. With these kinds of practices, science fiction isn't something escapist or exotic or inherently futuristic. It is just an attitude, an approach to critique that can be applied anywhere and by anyone. Great science fiction, the truly transgressive shit, proposes many different radical discontinuities at once, creating complex intellectual bombs that implode in the mind of the reader. But the important thing is that they always remain tethered to the world as we know it, to the world as it was before the questions were posed. Right? It always presents a clear road from the real to the discontinuous, a road that we can imagine walking, because otherwise there's no through line, there's nothing to hold on to, and therefore no longer has any position for real critique. It becomes just fantasy, or pure escapism, which, speaking of, is the line between science fiction and fantasy. For the fantasy writer, the fantasy artist, the creative act is one of pure imagination. His or her invented world does not need to hew to a physics consistent with our own. A fantasy writer is free to magically relax the structure of the cosmos at will. But if a science fiction writer wishes to do the same thing, they must invent a reason why and a method how, and then cope with the consequences. It's kind of a small difference. It may seem just like a conceptual stance, really, but it makes all the difference because waking up is what lends gravitas to dreams. I deal in science fiction partially for a living. Some of you may know me as a musician if you know me at all, but I edit a rogue science fiction imprint of Vice called Terraform. It's part of Vice's science and technology site, Motherboard, of which I am the futures editor, an invented job. Terraform is where we publish stories that speak to, extrapolate from, or otherwise in conversation with the news stories that my journalist colleagues are covering elsewhere on the Vice platform. So we connect our fiction in a very tangible way to the realities and anxieties of the present. And if someone reads a piece of speculative fiction on Terraform and is piqued by the issues that it raises, we have a very direct means for the readers to go back to read about what's actually happening in the present day through tags and suggested articles. I sometimes explain Terraform to people by saying it is tomorrow's news today. which is glib but fairly accurate. At Terraform, we deal with the near-term radical discontinuity, which means that we publish stories about things like drones and the gamification of war, misogyny on the web, new forms of protest in the 21st century, the ways in which social media changes our relationship to one another, etc. We only publish once a week, and our upper ceiling, unless something is exceptional, is around 2,000 words, which is sort of equivalent with a standard shareable news story on the web. So we can be quite nimble, and we often commission writers or work from our slush pile, depending on what people are talking about, what's going on in the world. So one of our favorite things to do, actually, is to commission journalists and nonfiction writers to extrapolate the ramifications of their own beats in a timely manner. So, for example, during a particularly hairy privacy scandal involving Uber, we had the technology writer Paul Ford write us a story about a dystopian future in which a self-aware entity named Uber controls all resources. During Coachella this year, we had the music and internet culture blogger Carls, formerly of Hipster Runoff, write us a picture of Coachella in the year 2065 as a scorching and inhospitable tent city in the militarized desert. Not everything that we do is this literal, obviously, because fiction is much more ambiguous than that, but we do find that these kinds of stories are the ones that receive the most engaged and immediate response from our audience, because their themes are already highlighted in public conversation, and I think ideally their themes evoke some latent anxiety that people have about the direction in which the world is heading. And so the work of the reader to locate the radical discontinuities within is fairly simple and even intuitive. It's been for us the most effective strategy for injecting fiction into the feed and seeing it shared the same way that nonfiction is shared. In some cases, we've used Terraform as a platform for direct critical response to issues about which we are passionate, some of which are self-reflexive. So, for example, this year there was a massive cultural upheaval in science fiction in which our most illustrious literary award, the Hugo, was overtaken legally but maliciously through the gaming of a public ballot by a conservative group advocating for a form of apolitical adventure yarn-style science fiction which perhaps never really existed. When men were men, when men were men and saved damsels from aliens in space, etc. Considering that the Hugos have honored some of the most progressive and radical voices of the last 100 years, people like Kurt Vonnegut and Ursula Guin and Samuel Delaney and Philip K. Dick and Octavia Butler, it seems disingenuous and myopic, to say the least, to imagine that it deserves to be in the hands of people who do not use science fiction in that way. Science fiction has always been a tool for the marginalized to imagine new worlds beyond the here and now. And so that nostalgia is ill-placed. So in reaction, Terraform commissioned a story from a Hugo-winning woman writer, Cameron Hurley, imagining what would happen when we no longer have the freedom to imagine our own futures, if we let the trolls win. I don't want to spoil it, but it's not good. And that's what science fiction does best. It uses speculation to shed light on the problems of the present, which in this case are the problems of science fiction itself. The kind of stuff that we publish on Terraform and that I love spiritually is quite close to what cyberpunk was in its prime. Fiction about the very near, the very close, the alarmingly corporeal realities of technology's incursions on our bodies, our societies, and our planet. I think that now more than ever, science fiction and art has a responsibility to be engaged head-on with the complexities of the world, because frankly, we need its power as a critical tool. At Terraform, we believe that fiction isn't just a place that we go to escape from reality. It is a place where we can come to understand and even take control over what is real. To test code, you have to run it. To see if a building will stand, you have to build a model. And for us, science fiction is the same thing. Science fiction's functionality has always been to take the world as we know it, to tweak some key variables, to create discontinuities, and let it run. What emerges from that experiment may not tell us anything meaningful about the future, but it's a really, really good mirror for the present. The core science fictional gesture of radical discontinuity is not unique to the written word. It's something that can be employed by anyone, any artist, any writer operating in fictional and non-fictional spaces alike. It's not watertight or isolated to genre. It's more like a tendency or an impulse that can be manifested in any number of ways by anyone interested in reality. So I hope that I've made clear that science fiction is a mechanism for understanding reality, and I want to leave you with a second stupid question, and that is, what is reality? Philip K. Dick defined reality as that which doesn't go away when you stop believing in it, which is a purposefully evasive definition that requires us to believe in nothing in order to prove the reality of anything. But By that definition, the future is real, because although it is intangible, it does not require our belief to exist. So the future is real, and it belongs to all of us and none of us at once. And the more we shore up its reality by writing about it seriously as though it were real, and identifying the variables which create it, the clearer our position in the present becomes. This, in my mind, is the real purpose of criticism, the role of criticism, not only to engage with the world, but to clarify our understanding of it so that we can live better within it. I'm going to leave you with this quote from my favorite critic, Robert Scholes. To live well in the present, to live decently and humanely, we must see into the future. Thank you.